evening's program. It is now my pleasure to introduce our distinguished guest. Dr. Ethan Chorin is the author of Exit the Colonel, The Hidden History of the Libyan Revolution, and was one of a small number of U.S. diplomats sent to Tripoli in 2004 to help reestablish a formal diplomatic presence. He served there as Economic and Commercial Officer from 2004 to 2006, for which he received a meritorious honor award. To expand trauma capacity in Libya. Fellow, Dr. Chorin holds a PhD in resource economics from UC Berkeley. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Ethan Chorin.
Good evening. Thank you very much, Ms. Risk, and to the World Affairs Council, and everyone for coming. I was wondering exactly who would find a talk on Libya more interesting than a Giants game. So, but in any case, well, the story of Libya is a long and complicated one, but also fascinating, I think. You know, I was approached, I was working in Dubai maybe a year and a half ago for a company out there, and I was approached just after the Libyan Revolution started about writing a book about the Libyan Revolution, which was a bit odd because no one knew, obviously, where things would go. So writing a proposal for the book, I think I had the first half, the pre-revolution was pretty much in my head, but the rest of it I had obviously little idea. So this was a process of basically completely changing and updating as things went on for about a year and a half. And I think my publisher was getting extremely frustrated. Not only at the situation, do we add another chapter? When does this thing end? Can you hear me? Is this okay? So I've been working in and on the Middle East for about close to 20 years, and my previous experience prior to Libya was mainly in Yemen and Jordan. I wound up in Libya a bit by a fluke. I joined the Foreign Service in 2004, and as a junior officer, I was not permitted to be sent to Iraq, which at the time was somewhat of a relief, although I volunteered later and that didn't work out. But I was offered assigned to Kuwait as a vice consul, and about 2 weeks before I was supposed to leave, which it may have been a bit more than that, a volunteer came out and said, looking for volunteers to go to Tripoli. And I thought, my God, this is exactly what I've joined the Foreign Service to do: go to a strange new place and try to figure out what's going on. I don't think I quite understood what was waiting for me, and a number of my colleagues tried to dissuade me from this, thinking that in fact things were a little bit too weird for somebody who wasn't quite accustomed to the Foreign Service environment yet. But it was an amazing time, and a lot of what happened during those 2 years, when I was serving as the commercial and economic officer, reporting on everything from the oil industry to potential for tourism, various other things. It was very hard for the State Department to get people into Libya, so I was doing a bit of everything. It was a very interesting time. Back really to the beginning of the Libyan regime, because the Libyan regime was basically built on a series of shifting plates, instability, chaos, competing centers of power. That was sort of how the lack of consistency and of stability was actually its strength in a way. The book, I think there are basically four takeaways from that I main themes in the book. One is the what I call the sort of the myth of Libyan irrelevance, which I think has been proven without my knowledge, former knowledge, by the role that Libya has played in the current election campaign, and for very unfortunate reasons. Basically, Libya, for over the last, say, 50 years of Libyan history, there have been various points in which Libya played a very important role in American foreign policy in ways which were not really recognized at the time. One role was, in the 60s under King Idris, when the U.S. was looking for allies in its struggle against communism. Essentially, Libya was seen to be a very poor, kind of irrelevant party state that we could give a little bit of aid to, but really wasn't so significant. The Libyans were very sort of annoyed that the United States was giving a lot of aid to Egypt, for example, to finance the Aswan Dam, things like this, and was paying absolutely no attention to them. So what the Libyan Prime Minister at the time did was to go and start courting the Soviets, and immediately the U.S. said, "Oh my God, let's do something about this. Let's give the Libyans some more financial assistance." In the early 70s, the Libyans played a very strong role in changing fundamentally the way that oil was priced. There was a posted price system where basically the producers shared about 50-50 of the profits with the national oil companies. Libyans squeezed the independents, in this case Occidental Petroleum, into essentially changing that whole structure in a way that was very favorable to the producing states, and basically made OPEC. So this had a huge impact, and this has been sort of ignored in many of the sort of assessments of Libya's relevance. More recently, obviously, when the Arab Spring came along, well, even before that, of course, Gaddafi had engaged in a whole long, sordid series of attempts to promote counter-revolutionary movements across Africa, which was, at best a major irritant to the United States. Participated in a number of very prominent attacks against U.S. interests, including, of course, the Lockerbie bombing and the UTA bombing, a year later in 1989. So Gaddafi was, Gaddafi and Reagan had this famous repartee, is maybe not quite the word, but they would insult each other on a regular basis, and there was a strong animosity and reason for that, which was somewhat lost on the Libyan people. I think many of them felt that, well, not lost, but many Libyans felt that this was not entertaining, but they sort of hoped that things would escalate, and maybe they might be rid of Gaddafi a little earlier. When the Arab Spring came along, basically, this is one of the main arguments of the book, is that Libya became one of the only places within the sort of array of states that were in tumult at that point, in which the United States could act and not risk a series of other consequences of which could be tremendous, like Syria. Conflict there was was seen to be, intractable. If Syria is connected to Iran, has a great influence in Lebanon, the whole sectarian situation there was such that some conflict could threaten to basically destroy a whole range of relationships which were very important to the U.S. Egypt and Tunisia were basically the rebellions had already reached a certain point. Ben Ali had been essentially, removed by the end of December, and Egypt, the United States, had been criticized for being a bit too late on the ball and trying to decide what exactly they wanted to do about it. Libya, at that point, was in the process of organizing its own revolution, and in effect, after the 2009 speech by Obama, the New Beginning speech that he made in Cairo, in which he promised to stand with the Arab street against tyranny, it would be a bit bizarre if the United States weren't to do anything. And I think Libya presented almost a unique and almost, in retrospect, an inevitable consequence of those statements. The other takeaway, that was a long first takeaway, but the other takeaways are the history of a history of poor intelligence on Libya. I mean, basically Libya, and this is very much characteristic of states that go into periods of extended sanctions. Iran, North Korea, Libya. Essentially, bureaucratically, when a state goes into that kind of an environment, the resources that had been developed previously through which our government understands how things are moving there and who are the major players, what's really happening on the ground, kind of get migrated to other more pressing problems. And one would certainly saw that in the case of Libya, where for a good 5 years there, the State Department's intelligence department and the other agencies we will not mention, basically had very few resources devoted to Libya, and we had no on-the-ground presence, so it was very difficult to figure out what was going on there. The third takeaway is the fact that, in fact, the rapprochement with the United States and by therefore the West actually turned into kind of a Trojan horse for the Libyan regime. This was Gaddafi thought this was an absolute, he'd gotten away with a tremendous victory. But in fact, and as I'll argue a bit later, this victory sowed the seeds of I believe, created an atmosphere in which the Arab Spring could propagate and be successful within Libya to an extent that it probably would not have had that rapprochement taken place. The fourth takeaway, I think, is most relevant to what's going on now, which is that after United States intervention in Libya, behind this coalition of other states, including the Arab Gulf states and others. That was the first major step. Now, what's happening next? If we take our attention away from, assume that there seems to be this sort of tacit feeling or bureaucratic kind of drift in which Libya becomes, it's almost like, well, we've done this and we're going to move on and focus on Syria, other places. Right now, Libya needs a tremendous amount of help in its quest to build up state institutions. I think the United States should and hopefully will play an increasing role in helping the country build its capacity in terms of not only governance but medical basic infrastructure. Libya has been neglected for many years, and it's sort of paradoxical that it has all this money, but is in many ways a very developing country. And a couple other points that are sort of the subject of many of the anecdotes that I put in the book have to do with the fact that personalities matter. Gaddafi himself was he was not an idiot. In fact, quite the contrary. He was a very shrewd person who had a number of, I'd say maybe psychological proclivities, something, I'm not sure what you could call it. He had his ways of dealing with things, and I think one of the secrets to his long success was the fact that he managed to confuse just about everyone while making sure that he had the upper hand. And I don't think that that the United States, particularly with this lack of kind of institutional continuity in terms of the knowledge that base that it had about Libya, was able to really understand, where exactly he was coming from. He was often written off as just a lunatic, but he was anything but. There are a series of pivotal points in the decline of the Libyan regime, and I think that basically you can date it back to the very beginning. The first couple chapters of the book are background, and it's kind of, some of it's a little heavier than others, but it's kind of necessary background. But the things start to get interesting really during the sanctions period, when Gaddafi was suffering increasing pressure from not only his own the junta, the people around him who helped him build his power base, but the people as a population as a whole who were basically in increasing straits. There were the Islamist opposition. There really wasn't much of a credible opposition to Gaddafi, but the Islamists, it's a very general term, and we've heard much about them recently, were a key element to this. There were something like 15 assassination attempts against Gaddafi over the period of the mostly the 80s into the 90s, and almost all of those had some involvement of these sort of ideologically charged groups, which had the support of the general population because they were the ones who were getting closest to essentially getting rid of him. One thing that was very much unknown to the West during the period of the 80s and 90s was the degree to which there were some massive citizen revolts. Some of them were connected to the Abu Salim massacre of 1996, which was a sort of a seminal event. I mean, basically Gaddafi's head of internal security, Abdullah Sanusi, was alleged to have overseen this, but it was basically a killing within a matter of hours of about 1,200 more political prisoners, the vast majority of whom were from the eastern regions, which were traditionally the seat of opposition to Gaddafi, and in a climate in which the tribal connections and the family connections were so strong, this act reverberated throughout the whole eastern sections of the country, and served to generate an incredible amount of hatred among the population. So it's absolutely no surprise that the revolution started in Benghazi. And in fact, in 2006, while I was still posted to Libya, there was a revolt basically a series of riots in Benghazi, following on the wearing of a T-shirt by an Italian minister depicting the offensive Danish cartoons that denigrated the Prophet Muhammad. And interestingly enough, that demonstration was actually orchestrated by Gaddafi himself in order to put pressure on the Italians to deliver reparations for war crimes, which were, in fact, the Italians did do a number on Libya. Basically, during the 30s and 20s, they essentially were responsible for the deaths of a fourth of the population. So this was not exactly a non-issue. But essentially, that was a fabrication that then went very much awry. The demonstration was against the Italian consulate, but as soon as people were finished demonstrating against the Italian consulate, they went on a rampage and basically gutted the outposts of the Social Security Fund and other government institution offices in Benghazi. That was never really, people didn't really pay much attention to that at the time. I don't think that story is actually widely known. But there was also a major riot in Zawiya, a coastal town, in 2002, in which something like 18 people of African origin were hanged in public, and this turned into a massive demonstration. Which again, people didn't really see this unfolding. This was not a something of which an incident of which the West was very much aware, even though opposition groups on the outside made many efforts to try to publicize these things. So the National Front for the Salvation of Libya, which has many ex-members in the current government, tried very hard to make bring attention to these incidents. Gaddafi was basically sealed off from the rest of the world for about basically 8 years. Things started to change a bit in 1998 with the Tanzania and Kenya embassy bombings, when that was sort of the first time that Al-Qaeda had surfaced as a major potential, actual threat, and had a name to it. And at that point, various U.S. government officials felt that maybe Gaddafi could be somewhat useful because he was fighting these same bad guys, and had spent much time for the previous 10 plus years, and particularly the immediate years immediately preceding this, cultivating ties and providing some largesse to states that were particularly in East Africa. So that was one issue, and that kind of also the sanctions regime. There are a lot of European companies that wanted to get back in there for the purpose of oil and lucrative contracts, and the whole sort of general enthusiasm for maintaining the sanction structure was eroding. So many people started to think, well, maybe this is a time to try to change things somewhat, shake things up as far as U.S. policy towards Libya. The real sort of game changer came with Iraq, and this is where there started to be two basically competing narratives that started, which were both inaccurate and harmful to the future of the country or Gaddafi's regime. One was the U.S., the Bush administration position that essentially Gaddafi was so scared by the idea that he would be hauled out of a spider hole. The ironies here are just sort of blossom, but so scared by this that he jumped into the idea of giving up his weapons of mass destruction, such as they were, and making peace with the U.S. through payments of reparations for the Pan Am bombing, etc. The U.S. for its part, saw this as things were in 2003, in the middle of 2003, were starting to go really badly in Iraq. This would be a great means of showing that, in fact, Iraq was there were positive consequences to Iraq. At least in terms of persuading other countries to change their ways. On the issue of weapons of mass destruction, there was a feeling that this could also provide, incidentally, since he did have some form of nuclear program, a non-proliferation success that could be also used effectively. It's interesting that during this period of time, the neocons, the individuals such as Paul Wolfowitz and others who were so, important in the articulation of the policy in Iraq and the intervention there, were absolutely dead set against Libya being a target. They thought that essentially this was, if you're going to go in there, you might as well do it right and get rid of the guy, but he's not really worth the effort. And so here you have Gaddafi thinking, oh my God. And Gaddafi was actually, by accounts of various people that I've interviewed who were as a part of that process, Gaddafi was concerned, but this process basically had started. He was suing for peace for decades before this, and he found this to be oh my God, this is a fantastic opportunity. So within Libya, of course, Colonel Gaddafi started to say, tell his people that, oh my God, I've pulled a rabbit out of a hat. You've been suffering for 10 years. You thought I could never do this, but I've got a victory. So everyone was happy, and in fact, the United States and Libya cooperated on a process which is the subject of another chapter, which is the makeover. The idea that we could describe what was going going to lay a roadmap for reform that was credible and had some substance to it. Now, of course, Gaddafi himself was a bit too out of touch and not considered sort of suitable to be the architect of this process, so the attention focused on his son and future heir apparent, Saif al-Islam, who essentially was quite different from many of his siblings in the fact that he had been exposed in the West and had sort of been raised in a very different environment than some of his brothers. I'm not counting the sister, who really never got so much involved in some of the scandals. He was charismatic, compelling. Many people found this to be him to be a suitable foil for his father and a symbol of what Libya could be. He began to engage in efforts to free hostages, to open up the press a bit, to push the limits of advocacy for various victims groups related to, say, now this is again, talk about the Bulgarian nurses scandal in which 360-odd infants were infected with HIV. I mean, the stories are actually quite amazing, and I go into them in quite a lot of detail in the book. But the interesting thing is that, and I don't take a position on what Saif al-Islam was thinking during this period, or how convinced he was that the reform was his calling, but his sort of pushing the limits of these freedoms enabled certain social networking to happen. I mean, this is not the sort of Facebook kind of processes, but everybody who was involved in the sort of the compromises that he was trying to, and deals that he was trying to effect to put Libya back into the spotlight as a sincere reformer. All of these people got to know each other quite well, and if you look at who was leading the revolution, these people all played very key roles. Mahmoud Jibril, who became the foreign minister and the prime minister, and was head of the executive office for the National Transitional Council, was head of the National Economic Development Board and hand chosen by Saif al-Islam. Fatih Turbil, the human rights lawyer, was essentially the person who was in charge of advocating on behalf of the victims of Abu Salam massacre. Fatih Baja who was one of the people who was one of the authors of the statement of principles of the revolution, and something that Ambassador Stevens, our most recent ambassador to Libya, felt was key, and that document was key, and these individuals were key to convincing the United States that actually there was a cohesive opposition that could take power and lead Libya into safer waters. And that class of people who were both of the regime but not of the regime, and who were sort of educated in the language of reform, was, I think, absolutely crucial to the U.S. support for Libya moving forward. But of course, and one of the other things that I get into in great detail in the book is the mistakes of this process, because I think that basically the biggest mistake that the United States made was to basically agree to this process without putting in place a very verifiable and strict set of conditions by which Gaddafi would be able to be brought into the fold of the international community. Even beginning with the Lockerbie negotiations about the Lockerbie compensation for the Lockerbie victims. The agreement was set between the lawyers for the families and the lawyers for the Libyan government. The U.S. government was not a party to this agreement. Yet the agreement itself specified very specific diplomatic actions and milestones that needed to take place in order for the money to be paid. So essentially, Gaddafi managed to take his most active opponents, the victims of the families of the victims of the Lockerbie bombings, and turn them into one of his greatest, not willing, but essentially a tool for his release from sanctions. Another mistake, I think, was the fact that the United States was so keen to get information on counterterrorism that it made agreements with Gaddafi, such as the rendition program, which has been brought to attention in recent months, and apparently is much broader, or at least somewhat broader than originally thought. So it's very hard to basically tell a regime like the Gaddafi's that you need to reform when you in fact you're delivering people to him to be tortured. That's that. The second part of the book is really focused on the history of the revolution itself. How did the revolution start? Who were the main actors? What happened? The blow-by-blow events, and it's really a fascinating story. I mean, it hasn't really been told in English. It's been told in Arabic a few times in different versions, and I've tried to give a kind of a sense of what things were like on the ground in Benghazi. Of course, I wasn't there then. I came a bit later, but it's a really inspiring story, and there are a lot of very heroic people who did tales of I know a physician who ran a network of clandestine clinics in people's houses. When people had gunshot wounds, they were brought to his clinics because they couldn't be brought to the hospital because they'd be killed or taken, or imprisoned. A group of doctors in Benghazi who came to basically revamp and reopen a hospital that had been shut for decades since it was built. As part of a policy of collective punishment that Gaddafi had instituted. And these people were working, were very educated, they were working abroad, they came back, they felt, that they had to help. The Libyan expatriate community was extraordinarily instrumental in helping. Although, in general, I think that this revolution was a youth-led popular revolution that anybody in Libya will even the people who were older and did not and those who didn't fight on the front lines felt very strongly that this was the case. Well, I think I'll leave the questions about the future of Libya and what's going on now to questions, because that's a whole nother ballgame. My book basically goes up to about August, July of last year, of this past year. One thing I think I can say is that it's very necessary at this point, particularly given what's happened, to try to take a much higher altitude view on what's going on in Libya right now and look at the progress that's been made, particularly in terms of elections and transfer of power. You've got lots and lots of chaos. The militias are a tremendous problem. There's a problem of the amount of armaments that's proliferated across Libya, which again is another indirect consequence of some of the policies that the West instituted, is a tremendous problem. But Libya has many things going for it. It's got a very small population, 6 million people. It's very wealthy, 78 billion barrels of proven reserves. The country itself is not fully explored because it's been off the map for quite a long time. If you look back at Libyan history, I think you see that there have been these periods of instability in which the various regions sort of separate out into their own tribal and sub-regional components as a means of protecting themselves in terms of crisis, but they have managed to come back, and there is a national sort of a historical cohesion there. That's worth a much more detailed argument, but I try to treat that again in the book. So I'm cautiously optimistic about Libya's future, and I think that it's a region that's actually much more important to U.S. foreign policy, particularly now than at any time in the past. There's an interesting paradox, which is that again, it's a very wealthy country, but because it's a wealthy country, it's not seen to be administratively or otherwise not deserving, but the mechanics are not there for technical assistance and aid to be provided to a very rich country in anticipation of some future payment. And that's actually, it's a simple statement, but it's causing all sorts of problems at the moment. So thank you very much. And if I have any questions, I'd be very happy to answer them.
Well, thank you for those remarks, Dr. Chorin. And we have numerous questions here. And so let's start with a broad question which is basically relates a whole series of questions about the recent attack in Benghazi, which is probably not in your book, which resulted in the death of Ambassador Stevens and 3 other Americans. And perhaps you could give us your view of that and what you think happened, and then I can get into a few more of the questions here.
Well, obviously, this has been the subject of an enormous amount of discussion over the last couple of weeks, and I have to say that, first of all, it was an absolutely tremendous loss. Ambassador Stevens was a truly remarkable person. I had the great pleasure of working with him a bit on this project to develop some medical capacity in eastern Libya. At least he was very supportive of it. I think that was his role. He felt that the United States should be involved very actively and deeply in reconstruction efforts, and that in fact, this myth of Libyan irrelevance was just that. As far as I and several colleagues were in Benghazi on the 10th, 11th, and 12th, and much of our knowledge of what happened stems from a series of conversations that I had with, one conversation with Ambassador Stevens about 2 hours before the attack occurred, and then after that with a couple of conversations with one of his security detail. And the last one of those was literally as the attack was taking place. One thing I can say is that I absolutely, I find it hard to believe that the Obama administration is engaged in some kind of conspiracy to deny what's happening here for political reasons, but. Clearly, and there may be good reasons for, it's unclear exactly why Ambassador Stevens was in Benghazi at that time. And again, I can't comment on that, other than to say that he wasn't there to visit with us, which wasn't reported in the press. Benghazi was a volatile place. We had significant reservations about making this last trip. Obviously, it was the anniversary of 9/11. There's a new government being appointed, a new prime minister being appointed in Tripoli. There was a history of attacks against high-level diplomatic installations over the course of the previous 6+ months. And you have to, we felt not comfortable, but okay this time going there because we were not figures of great importance. But it was clearly a highly dangerous and volatile environment. The other thing I'd say about that is that the difference between what's been coming out in the U.S. press versus what's been coming out in the Arab papers is quite interesting. And some of the more complete and detailed accounts, incredible accounts, I think have come from those sources.
There's a question here about that consulate attack that says, where do you think the failure occurred, and what would you do to correct it? What would you recommend the U.S. government do to correct it?
Well, I mean, I think that, clearly there were some failures because it succeeded, but those failures, I think, are diffuse. Obviously, one would have hoped that the Libyan government and people would have been able to provide their protection for our people, and certainly Ambassador Stevens was actually much loved within Benghazi. To an extent that was very visible as we left. So that's one failure, if you want to put it like that. I think the State Department and other bureaucracies have some issues with transitional presences. This was not technically a consulate. It's been called a consulate, but technically it was some form of official outpost. When I was based in Tripoli, we were living in the designation was a liaison office. These kinds of scenario, the diplomatic security is much more comfortable with standard embassies and fortification, standard procedures, and there aren't any standard procedures in these circumstances. And you also have the question of making sure that you're not offending the local government and infringing upon sovereignty and things like this. So, but I think that's an area in which I hope this review commission will look very, very carefully. Ambassador Pickering is heading that, and I don't think that he is. As part of the sort of the hype around this, I mean, I've seen reports that people accusing him of being somehow sympathetic to the regime in Iran and somehow sympathetic to Islamist ideologies and things like this, which is just absolutely ridiculous.
Well, thank you. Let's shift a little bit, and there's a question here about how does the Libyan public view the U.S.? Is there a difference of opinion in the various regions in Libya?
Well, I think the Libyan people as a whole think of and again, this is obviously a generalization, but I think a strong one, are very sympathetic to the U.S. I think there's almost because of Gaddafi, of the fact that Libya was isolated from the West for so long, there have been this sort of idealization, particularly among the older people in Libya, of the U.S. in the 60s and the 50s as this, as at the height of its global political power. There's a great, when I was there as in the commercial capacity, there was a tremendous interest in re-engaging with the U.S. and visiting the U.S. and studying there. And I think this situation is far different, actually, and more profound than that, which, the idea that we would go into Iraq and be greeted as liberators. I mean, we had a very different role in Libya, but there's a very palpable affinity for the U.S. And I think that Libya has gotten a very bad rap in the West. Starting with the Sinjar records, which were a cache of documents that were discovered during the Iraq War along the Syrian border, in which it was discovered that sort of a random sample of demographic information, IDs, things like this, which placed a disproportionate number of these people, which was about 500-something people, from Libyan towns in eastern Libya. And that was turned into this whole narrative that Derna, the town of Derna, was a hotbed of Islamic radicalism, and Benghazi as well. And that's not without its merits, but it gives an image of the entire eastern part of Libya as being just filled with these rabidly anti-American individuals, which simply is not the case.
We have a couple of questions about Libya today. And there's a comment that says Libya has tremendous ancient Roman sites, the Lepta Magna, if I'm reading Leptus Magna. Have they survived? Are they being protected now?
Well, as far as I know, I haven't heard of any attacks against Leptus Magna, but another one of the big sites, Sabrata, has been targeted by so-called Islamist, Salafist groups. So there's been a lot of, there are also, the Italians left a number of statues which many locals felt were too racy for them and were subject of a lot of defacement. And just a couple of months before the attack against the outpost, a number of Sufi shrines were basically bulldozed in plain daylight with ruined relics dating back to the and construction dating back to the 17th century. So, so far, some of the more majestic Roman ruins, I think, are still, and the Greek ruins in the east are still, intact. We'll hope that continues to be the case.
Then there are a few questions about, I guess, more economic questions. Countries and foreign investors are hesitant to invest in the oil-producing country because the militias still seem to call the shots. So it's a question of law and would you invest there? And then there was another question about contractors being paid, which they were not. The question asserts that they were not under Gaddafi, and is there more of an environment which would encourage people to do business in Libya now?
Well, on one positive front, the mainstay of the Libyan economy, oil, has basically bounced right back. The conflict did not destroy much of the Libyan oil industry. It was quite light as compared with Iraq, where Saddam Hussein destroyed many of the oil wells and made lots and lots of problems on that score. So Libyans have money. The problem is, there is still a culture of old habits die hard. Under Gaddafi, corruption was absolutely rampant. Any transaction basically required side payments. This discouraged many American companies from doing business there because of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, etc. The oil companies all found some accommodation which made sense, and there were a lot of cases under Gaddafi where contractors were not paid. I'm not sure this is or were paid with a tremendous delay. I'm not sure that that's unique to Libya, but it was certainly pronounced there. Right now, of course, in Benghazi and Libya generally, the question of security is number one, just as it is for the Libyan citizens. So we've seen a sort of many U.S. companies putting a hold on their activities. But as soon as and hopefully things will improve soon. It's going to be a long process. There's a process of creating a constitution, which is going to take several months. There has been some progress, not massive, but some progress in integrating the Thuwar, the former rebels, into a national army. Although that army still only has a very small area of control. But that's going to be the major task of the new government, is to figure that out.
So let's look now at tribal differences. There's a question here about the role that tribal differences played in the war, and then also how will they play in the future in terms of the unity of the country. So can you address that issue?
Well, one thing that I'd written a few pieces before as the conflict was unfolding, and many Libyans and Arab scholars of Libya made the same points, that in fact the whole tribal issue in Libya was sort of in many degrees overstated. Not to say that the tribalism was not a major factor in Libyan society, but there were a number of polls that were taken in which suggested that the influence of tribal loyalties had diminished significantly over the course of Gaddafi's rule. In part because he played this. He was very keen on attenuating the links between the tribes, and part of his process of creating confusion and dividing people rather than having them, united against him in any fashion. At the same time, he encouraged and gave a lot of patronage to several key tribes, the Warfalla, the Megaraha, others, and his own tribe, the Gaddafi, which is much smaller. And those alliances are, fueling much of the remaining sort of hotspots, such as the Bani Walid, Misrata conflict. Those issues are still very much there, and I think in times of chaos, people revert to their tribal affiliations as a form of social, safety net. So as long as there's chaos, or a vacuum of power, the more influence the tribes have. But historically, over the last 30 years, the influence of the tribes in Libya has actually, it's one thing that Gaddafi did quite assisted. Now the question is, where are we going from here?
So where are we going from here?
Well, that really depends on the ability of the, there are a lot of parties who would like to see Libya remain divided and unstable, not least of which the elements of the former regime, I think. That the degree to which the former regime is still active in terms of its proxies and loyalist elements is not clear. There are estimates that there are something like anywhere between $100 and $700 billion that are outside of the country, and potentially at the disposal of people who would like to create chaos there. The weapons issue is obviously compounding that question. There are a lot of the foreign countries, in the Arab world, the Gulf states, who would like to, who are promoting alternate visions of order in order to increase their own presence, their influence in Libya. If people could just, it's sort of like, the parallel with Lebanon, if people could just sort of leave Libya alone for a little bit to make its own way, things would be far better. And that's where an area in which I think the EU and the US and others and the Arab states can play a significant role in Libya in terms of making sure that infrastructure projects move forward, and that there's training and technical assistance and things like this. As we've just talked about, in a lot of organizations, including ours and some of our colleagues, who are very hesitant to do work in Libya because they feel unsafe, and they're not quite sure how supportive the West is going to be to their efforts moving forward.
So what kind of government do you predict will, they say rise up, but what kind of government do you see in the future of Libya?
Well, I think so I say that so far the process of creating viable democratic institutions has moved forward remarkably well. Again, we saw from the original statement of principles by a small group of unelected people to a transitional national transitional council that served its term and then went on to basically handed over power upon liberation, and that there was basically free and fair elections for a national constitutional assembly, and local elections proceeded again. Sort of the local elections in Benghazi in May were deemed to be exemplary, and that was sort of a model for the elections that were going to take place after that. There's a question of federalism and whether the region, this is long-standing regional tension between Benghazi and Tripoli, and Benghazi sees itself as the sort of standard bearer of the revolution, and then the power center was then transferred back to Tripoli, which was originally its oppressor, and where are we going to go for, those issues are still present, but they require strong leadership. And I have to say that from everything that I can tell so far, there was a previous prime minister who was basically not able to form a government. The latest one, Ali Zidane, appears to be a bit more, maybe have learned from the mistakes of his predecessor and seems to be a bit more of a forceful personality. These Mahmoud Jibril is head of who was a very prominent figure in the National Transitional Government, is head of the largest secular party. This is another distinguishing factor about Libya, is that compared to all of the other Arab states, here was a country in which the Islamists did not, where there was a successful revolution, and the Islamists did not win a majority in the popular elections. Now Libyans sort of are half joking that this is the one country in which they didn't win, but they are still going to win because everyone suspects that there's forces lurking beneath the surface. But again, where Libya goes depends on its being able to sort of coalesce long enough for some of those institutions to take hold. And I don't think that they can be expected to do that all on their own. At the same time, Libyans, I think, also need to be able to articulate their needs in a way where, that's been a problem as far as certain types of aid, is that the perception on the West side is, okay, just tell us what exactly you need, and we can, respond to that. But there's quite a bit of divisiveness about, relying on outside powers, and who gets control of what. That's an issue.
One of the questions here is what can the U.S. do to help bring them to an outcome that would be in our interest?
Well, one thing the U.S. can do is not to take a lesson from this, from the tragedy of Benghazi, to say that Libya is basically beyond redemption, and this is all part of a predictable course of trajectory that many people predicted before the intervention, that Libya would descend into a giant Somalia. I think that, and I know that Ambassador Stevens and many of the people who worked with him felt very strongly that Libya was worth increased attention. And I think that I know that there are people at USAID and other agencies in the government and the State Department who are working who are sincere and passionate advocates for increased assistance to Libya. And again, Libya is not a poor country, but it needs help with institutions. So that's an area in which the U.S. can certainly help a lot more than I think is happening right now.
So you've given us the sort of several year out picture, but if you look 10 years out, what do you see happening?
You're really
to the
asking
country?
for a lot.
I don't know. That the audience is asking.
10 years out, I don't know. I think if you look at Libyan history, they've been through a lot. It's a country that with even with Gaddafi and taking away the rhetoric about the personal animosity between Gaddafi and several U.S. presidents. There was always this kind of something that I would call sort of like this exceptionality, this view that despite all of that, Libya and the United States have a very close and kind of fundamental affinity. And it hasn't been expressed in like dysfunctional family. It's not been expressed in a very productive way. But I think that there is something there that can be built upon, and that Libya, like in many ways Iran, without the Iranian regime, it would be a natural ally for the United States. The problem is making sure that the institutions reflect the views of the people.
That's taken us through many of the questions, but perhaps you could give us a perspective on what you're working on right now.
For the last year, I and a couple of colleagues, particularly a Libyan American friend, who a long-time friend, have been working to try to. We've set up an NGO that's working to establish relationships between U.S. institutions, teaching hospitals, and parallel institutions in Libya to create, for example, in Benghazi, a dedicated trauma center for emergency medicine. Our role is mainly as sort of catalyst, but we're also doing some small grant programs we're about to give we hope a grant to a very strong organization based in Tripoli to do some diabetes outreach. Diabetes and hypertension are a huge public health issue in Libya, and there's a lot of awareness that can be given to that topic.
Are there no trauma centers in Libya?
Well, actually, there are very few. I mean, the Libyan medical infrastructure has been during Gaddafi rather awful. I mean, actually, Tunisia built up a whole corridor of medical tourism based on Libyan clientele. If you were sick in Libya and you had the resources, you jump into an ambulance and go to Tunisia, and they used that in order to create a whole industry that catered to Eastern Europe, the former Soviet states. And this is a huge industry now for Tunisia. Those resources can be brought back into Libya. Benghazi has no ambulance at the moment. It also has no addresses, which is a big problem. I mean, like in many countries in the Middle East, actually have this problem. In Africa, in general, developing world have no addresses. But Libya has has so it has enough money to have had to install that system before. So we're working with another organization that actually has developed a very unique approach to that, using virtual addresses, where essentially an ambulance can be using GPS devices dispatched to a location that doesn't have a physical address.
Well, it sounds like there's some very basic problems, but you're optimistic about the future.
Well, I mean, I think there's some serious problems, obviously, but in general, there are a lot of reasons why Libya, I think, is exceptional and could be a model state in the future, somewhere down the line. I think maybe 5 to 10 years is probably the minimum amount it's going to take.
Well, this concludes our program for this evening. On behalf of the World Affairs Council, please join me in thanking Ethan Chorin for his excellent talk and discussion.